Okay, welcome to part 4, where I will defend steps 5 through 7 of the argument for the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. Let us begin with step 5, which is that the first manuscripts accurately contain the events of Jesus' ministry. And since the manuscripts were transcribed accurately, there's more to come on that in step 6. This is another way of asking, do the gospels we have today accurately contain what the original authors wrote? This step is, on the surface, difficult to defend because there are no extant manuscripts in this period by which to directly check the accuracy of transmission. So how do we know that in the 100 to 200 years between the Gospels being written and the first extant manuscripts that they weren't somehow corrupted? In fact, it is a fundamental belief of the LDS, or Mormon, Church that during this time, or close to it, that a great apostasy happened, meaning that heresies and false teachings crept into the Christian church, resulting in the corruption of the manuscripts that we have today. So how do we know that the true message wasn't corrupted or altered in some way in these critical first centuries of the church? How do we know that what we have in our Bibles is what the original authors wrote? To answer this, I will be giving some general answers. I will then use the Great Apostasy as a case study by which to further illustrate the truth of step 5. Now, to clarify, the gap in time that we are talking about is anywhere from about 100 years to about 170 years, depending on the gospel. Presumably, they were being copied down by early Christians. How do we know that they copied it accurately and that it wasn't corrupted? I have 3 answers for this. Firstly, I will appeal to the background information I gave in part 1, specifically the time gap between the earliest extant manuscripts and the events it records. Why is this important? Because the shorter the time gap is, the less opportunity there is, from our modern perspective, for corruption or alterations to creep in. So, the gap between the earliest extant manuscripts and the events they record is used as a metric of a given document's authenticity. This is also the case with the number of manuscripts and the consistency between them, which we will introduce later. But for now, let's talk about the time gap. The time gap between the supposed events and the time of our earliest extant manuscript, according to part 1, is about 900 years for Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, about 770 years for the Iliad, and about 250 years for Demosthenes' speeches. And for the New Testament, it is less than 100 years. This is remarkable by historical standards. If a 900-year gap is enough for us to know that what we have today is what the original author wrote, then how much more would that be the case for the gospel accounts, for which the gap is only about 100 years? So yes, it is possible that the early Christians that copied the gospel accounts from about AD 60 to AD 130 botched some of the events, resulting in consistent error in all the manuscripts that came after that. It is possible that they were corrupted, but do historians seem to be worried about that? Not really, for it is reasonable to assume that in the New Testament's case, that if we have thousands of manuscripts covering about 13 centuries, and they all say roughly the same thing, that is also the case for the century or two that we don't have manuscripts. Furthermore, I explained in part 1 that it is unreasonable to demand that we have the original manuscript in our hands by which to fact-check the accuracy of transmission in this time period. This is because of the biodegradable nature of the papyrus they used to write on, because it might have been destroyed, because of the limited number of manuscripts when the Christian church was just getting started, and because of the difficulties in being able to confirm that a given manuscript is the original one. For these reasons, no one demands that we have the original manuscript, or manuscripts even close in time to the original. It is assumed by historians and archaeologists that the message in the first extant manuscript was actually written down much earlier. What no one does is suggest that the message was corrupted in the time for which we have no extant manuscripts. To do this for documents like the gospel accounts would undermine everything we know about ancient history. My second answer also comes from part 1 and discusses another metric of a document's authenticity, specifically the number of extant manuscripts. I said that the New Testament has about 24,000 of these, whereas the closest runner-up is the Iliad, which has about 2,000 manuscripts. Why is this important? because the greater the number of manuscripts, the greater the degree of certainty that we can know what the original message was. Here's what I mean. Imagine you are reading the following text messages from your friend who is a regular at the gym. The first one is received at 10 a.m. and says, "I am lifting gym." You were a bit confused, for they go to the gym to lift weight in the gym, not the whole gym. But we can probably guess what the message they originally meant to type was, and you assume that they had a typo adding an extra M to gym. But a half hour later, at 10:30, our gym bro friend sends another text. This one says, "Lifing at gym," and there are a bunch of special characters sprinkled throughout it. You think, that's weird, he just needs to figure out how to text. But we can probably guess what he means. Another half hour passes, and you get yet another text from him, which says, "I at the gym." You think, man, he spelled gym correctly this time, but everything else sounds like a caveman. Typical gym bro. Another half hour passes, and you get yet a fourth text from him, which says, "I am at MIG." This time he spelled gym backwards. At this point, you don't get any more texts from him. He probably gave up trying to convey what he originally meant. His thumbs were probably too muscular from all the weights he's lifting to hit the right characters on his keypad. But do the differences and alterations between text messages make it impossible to deduce what the original message was? No, for we could piece them together to know what he meant to say, which is, "I am lifting at the gym." It was the number of text messages that allowed us to deduce that. One could say that the more texts there are, the easier it is to deduce what the message originally was. And this is analogous to what the New Testament authors originally wrote. We have about 24,000 manuscripts of the New Testament written across 14 centuries. By comparing them, we can know with near historical certainty what the original message was. And as we will see in step 6, the distortion rates between manuscripts are much lower than they were for the text messages, making this even easier than it was for the texts. In some cases, however, the differences between them actually allow us to know with greater certainty what the original message was, similar to how we would know the meaning of a word with greater certainty by looking at its synonyms in a thesaurus. This is why, in the study of ancient history, more manuscripts is better. I am aware that this analogy is not perfect, for we have in our text messages that which we know was written by the original author, whereas with the New Testament manuscripts, there is at least a 70-year gap. But that is why I cited the comparison of time gaps from part 1 for my first answer. As it is, when compared to other works of classical literature, the gospel accounts have far more manuscripts with a far smaller time gap. This means that if we know what the original author wrote for works like the Iliad, which has about 2,000 manuscripts written at least 770 years after the fact, then we should know with even more certainty what the gospel writers originally wrote, since they have about 24,000 manuscripts, the earliest of which was written less than 100 years after the fact. And the Iliad has the best metrics of the classical works. Others that are still taken as credible have even less. Conversely, to question our ability to know what was in the original gospel accounts, as the LDS Church does, is to question all of what we know about ancient history. And on what basis is it questioned? It is because of what the Book of Mormon says, whose first extant manuscript, if we want to call it that, was written by Joseph Smith anywhere from 1,200 to 2,200 years after the fact. Now one might object, saying that I am comparing apples to oranges here. We cannot compare secular works to the Gospels, since the Gospels were religious and are far more likely to be embellished or fraudulent. I feel like I addressed this in step 4, which said that the Gospels are not concerningly biased or fraudulent. In fact, ancient history is often written from manuscripts whose sources are biased, but a different standard is used on the Gospels. Others might object on the grounds that I am misrepresenting the number of New Testament manuscripts, since most of them are fragments and do not contain the whole of the text. But we are comparing the New Testament to other works that we take as credible, using the same standard. And that standard is that even if something is only a fragment, it is still counted as a manuscript. because it is obvious that a fragment is part of something bigger, just as the partial text messages were assumed to represent a whole message. To question our knowledge of the New Testament on the basis that we mostly have fragments would be to question all other works of ancient history. But if we accept that we have the actual events of Caesar's Gallic Wars, even though there are only 9 manuscripts in good condition written about 900 years after the fact, then how much more would we accept a New Testament that has about 24,000 manuscripts written less than 100 years after the fact? Even if we combine the shortest time gap from Part 1, which is about 120 years from Plato's tetralogies, and the greatest number of manuscripts, which is around 2,000 from Homer's Iliad, that still does not come even close to the metrics of the New Testament. The New Testament has a far greater number of manuscripts, the earliest of which are separated by far less time from the events they are recording. We know with near historical certainty that what is in our Bibles today is what the Gospel authors wrote. And this is not even counting the New Testament quotations from the early church fathers, which, according to Part 1, numbers to about 36,000. It has been said that even if all of the almost 24,000 New Testament manuscripts went missing, that we could reconstruct about 95% of the New Testament purely from the quotes of the church fathers. This would include the later church fathers too, but 36,000 quotes is still quite a few, and I bet that most of the New Testament is quoted in them. Now, the manuscripts that contain them are generally less reliable than those for the New Testament, but this still counts for something, providing even more ways for scholars to discern what the original message was. My third reason for Step 5 comes from Step 2 and from Step 4. From Step 2, I think that the interdependent nature of the accounts that we have today rules out unintentional errors and intentional corruption. That is, if the early Christians unintentionally altered some of the events between AD 60 and AD 130, we would expect there to be some major contradictions in the accounts we have today. But that is not what we have today. It also suggests that intentional alterations are not likely, for surely they would have made an error at some point. And in Step 4, the possibility of intentional alterations was addressed in more detail. To say that the manuscripts were corrupted intentionally is without basis, for there is strong evidence within the text itself that suggests that is not the case. So, from the standards used on other documents and from the quality and interdependent nature of the manuscripts, the earliest manuscripts we have today are likely to contain the original message of the gospel writers. Know that if one is going to posit that the message we have today is corrupted, then the burden of proof is on them to show what the original message really was. Otherwise, the gospel accounts are all we have. So if one posits that a great apostasy happened right after the apostles died, where many plain and precious truths were lost, they need to do more than just say it is possible. They need to address the evidence I just gave, suggesting that this is unlikely, as well as give positive evidence for who the culprit was that did this, and what the true message really was. But this is generally not done, as we will see. In addressing the great apostasy, I am not singling out the LDS Church or picking on their beliefs. I am merely using their belief as a case study by which to further illustrate the truth of Step 5. The LDS Church just happens to be a prime example of one who would challenge Step 5 of my argument. So, by defending against the great apostasy, I am defending against most of the objections that would target Step 5. So what is this great apostasy? This is the apostasy at the institutional level of the entire Christian church. So, the entire Christian church as an institution disappeared off the face of the earth, starting from the time just after the apostles died until Joseph Smith restored it in the 1800s, so about a 1700-year gap. Now, this happened institutionally. Most Mormons believe that individual Christians still existed in this time, but that the church as Christ founded it was not represented as an institution. This is a common misconception. They aren't saying that everyone apostatized or that everyone was a heretic. It was only at an institutional level. So the Catholic Church that existed in this time were the various Protestant denominations, they would say, as institutions are apostate churches, not the real thing. but they would say that despite this, there are many true believers within them. Now, one of the effects of the great apostasy that is relevant to our arguments here is that the manuscripts were tampered with, such that many quote-unquote plain and precious truths were left out of the Bible, the Gospels included. So many of the key LDS doctrines, such as eternal marriage and progression to godhood, are left out of the Gospels we have today because supposedly someone tampered with the manuscripts. So the Gospels as we have them today are at best incomplete and at worst wrong on some matters. This is why many who are LDS will say that the Bible is correct insofar as it is translated correctly. Now we know that this tampering must have occurred before the time of the first extant manuscripts, which are dated to about AD 125 to AD 200. Why? Because as we will see in step 6, all the manuscripts say basically the same thing. Of the 24,000 or so extant New Testament manuscripts we have, not one of them, to my knowledge, mentions these plain and precious truths like progression to godhood. So, the tampering must have occurred sometime before the first extant manuscript. Otherwise, the manuscripts before the tampering and the manuscripts after the tampering would say very different things. This is the case not just for the LDS Church, but for anyone who would suggest that the manuscripts were tampered with. There is a relatively short window of time, historically speaking, in which this could have happened. Luckily for the LDS Church, the main time frame offered for the Great Apostasy is right after the last of the apostles died, so roughly about AD 100. And this is before the first extant manuscripts start showing up, so at face value, the idea is plausible. After all, we don't have any extant manuscripts by which to check how accurately the message was transmitted. But there are some problems with this, based on what we have covered. In presenting these problems, I hope to use the Great Apostasy as a case study by which to further illustrate the truthfulness of Step 5. Firstly, positing the Great Apostasy uses a double standard, because if any other ancient document had the number, time gap, and consistency of the manuscripts that the Gospel accounts have, historians would say that they know the original message with near historical certainty, not that it was corrupted or tampered with. But a different standard is used by the LDS Church. As it is, to question that what we have today was the original message, as the LDS Church does, is to question just about everything we know about ancient history. In other words, the default mode, based on the metrics of the Gospel accounts, is to accept that what we have today is the original message. To overcome this would require that positive evidence for them being tampered with be given, which is not often done. The second, and perhaps largest problem is that the Great Apostasy lacks a plausible culprit. This is because of the largely uncontrolled dissemination of the manuscripts up until about AD 200. For whoever corrupted the manuscripts apparently did such a good job that not even one manuscript containing the true gospel survived. But controlling the dissemination of manuscripts would have been extremely difficult, for in the first 50 or 60 years or so after Jesus' resurrection, Christianity spread rampantly across 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, across many ethnic groups, each with their own language, customs, and jurisdiction. All of these were copying the gospel accounts as needed in a manner that was not necessarily in the public eye. There is simply no agency or ruler or kingdom that would have been able to control all that so as to completely obliterate the true gospel message from the record. Now, I am assuming that the manuscripts all say roughly the same thing, which is defended in Step 6. In that case, whoever corrupted the message did a really, really good job, such that every single manuscript we have today unanimously preaches the same altered message. To see why this is unlikely, let's test our logic against a few culprits, starting at the institutional level. What about the Roman Empire? Maybe they corrupted the manuscripts. After all, didn't they start persecuting Christians around AD 50 or AD 60? The last part is true, and one of the ways that they did this was by destroying whatever manuscripts they could get their hands on. The persecution stopped in the early 4th century. This is one reason why there are no complete manuscripts of the Bible until the Codex Vaticanus, which was written around AD 325. However, despite the efforts of the Roman Empire, we still have extant manuscripts from that time. It is estimated that there are at least 11 manuscripts dating from before the 4th century AD. That may not seem like much, but by historical standards, this is remarkable. To have even one manuscript from that close to the events in question is good, let alone having that despite the efforts of a big bad empire like Rome. And it is likely that there are many more manuscripts from that time that weren't destroyed by the Romans, that were destroyed by other means, or that degraded with time, or that simply haven't been discovered yet. And 11 is a conservative estimate. I read one skeptic who put the number around 40 or 50, and Wikipedia, for what that is worth, estimates a similar number. So, the Roman Empire at the height of their power couldn't control the dissemination of manuscripts, meaning that whoever erased the true gospel message from the record had to have more power than the Romans. Who might this be? Usually the answer is unknown. As it is, the consistency among New Testament manuscripts is strong evidence that we have the gospel author's original message. For there is simply no one that could erase the original message to such a comprehensive degree. Well, maybe it was the Roman Catholic Church. They corrupted the manuscripts. Well, the Catholic Church didn't have even close to the amount of power necessary to do this until about the 4th or 5th century AD. But the manuscripts before this time and after this time say the same thing, meaning that they were not tampered with. And, like the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church, to my knowledge, tried to control the dissemination of the Bible too. Only in their case, it was with the Protestant Bibles in the Reformation. And they completely failed. Granted, this occurred after the printing press was invented, but it still shows my point that controlling the dissemination of manuscripts to the degree that the LDS Church says it happened is pretty much impossible. Surely we would have at least one surviving manuscript containing the, quote, plain and precious truths that were lost, but none exists. Besides, why would the Catholic Church, if they had such incredible power, have left things in the New Testament that contradict them? For things like the intercession of Mary, purgatory, and the paying of indulgences are all contradicted by writings of the New Testament. Even if these are not actual contradictions, they certainly appear to be. Why did the Catholic Church not remove those verses which could potentially, and eventually did, undermine their power? The only reasonable explanation is that they couldn't. So, if neither the Roman Empire nor the Catholic Church at the height of their power could pull off similar feats as the corruption of manuscripts required for the Great Apostasy, then who could possibly have done it? Well, maybe it wasn't an institution. Maybe it was the gradual effect of the surrounding culture on the Christian church. Perhaps the Christian church was defeated not by brute force, but by infiltration. But again, this lacks a plausible culprit. For if we suggest that it was Jewish thought that infiltrated the church, such that every single manuscript was corrupted, the Jews were relatively limited in scope. They were not densely populating 3 different continents and diverse ethnic groups. Besides, many of the things in the New Testament that they supposedly inserted, or at least didn't choose to take out, directly contradict traditional Jewish thought. For example, saying that Jesus is the Messiah. One cannot say that Jewish thought corrupted the manuscripts when the manuscripts contradict them. Well, maybe it was the Greeks. They were pretty influential, right? Once again, they lack the scope. And like the Jews, much of what is in the New Testament, such as monotheism, contradicted their beliefs, making them an unlikely culprit. The same could be said of Roman thought. As it is, the fact that the New Testament and the Gospel accounts contradict just about every surrounding culture in many ways makes these cultures unlikely culprits. For we would expect that if the surrounding culture had such influence over the New Testament manuscripts, that the doctrine contained in them would look more like what they believed. At the very least, they would have omitted those parts that contradict them. But that is not the case. Ironically, it is the LDS beliefs, not the beliefs in the New Testament that we have today, that resemble those of the surrounding cultures. For example, the LDS Church promotes the worship of at least 2 gods, the Father and the Son, in addition to whoever becomes a god in the afterlife. So, they are polytheistic. Now, the Greeks and the Romans were already polytheistic. If Greek and Roman culture had such a powerful effect on what is in our manuscripts today, why do we not see at least one mention of polytheism or something about the progression to godhood in even one of the 24,000 extant manuscripts? In fact, we see quite the opposite. One of the New Testament's central claims is that there is one God worthy of worship and that Jesus Christ is that God. I defend this in my series titled, Did Jesus Claim to be God? Assuming that is the case, this certainly didn't come from the Romans or the Greeks. And the Jews believed in one God, but they were quite opposed to the idea of Jesus being that God. So it didn't come from them. As it is the LDS beliefs that resemble what was in the surrounding cultures, not the New Testament that we have today. Now, some Mormons might disagree when I say that LDS theology is polytheistic. Some prefer to be called henotheistic, which means that there are many gods with one supreme God reigning above them all. Now, I think they are polytheistic for reasons I won't discuss here, but even if they were henotheistic, did not the Greeks believe in a head deity, Zeus? And for the Romans, it was Jupiter, so it doesn't affect my point. Another example is that the LDS Church believes in justification by works, at least in part. This means that we are made right in God's eyes, at least in part, by the good things we do. The Greeks, Romans, and Jews already believed this. If they had such a powerful influence on the manuscripts we have today, then why did we not see this doctrine laid out more clearly in the New Testament? As it is, we see quite the opposite. The New Testament supports the idea of justification by faith. This means that there is nothing good we do that makes us right before God. We are entirely dependent on His grace. And this contradicts just about every other world religion, including those of the cultures of the 1st century A.D. Note that this is a problem not just for the Great Apostasy, but for any theory that says the manuscripts were corrupted. Why would they have invented such an unpopular message? But we could add the New Testament teachings on the equal status of men and women, showing charity to the poor, submission to the emperor, and many others that flew in the face of the surrounding cultures. There was a reason Christians were persecuted so much, and it wasn't because they had been influenced by the surrounding culture. Ironically, LDS theology, with its emphasis on the spiritual realm, justification by works, personal revelation, and secret knowledge that is only available to the spiritual elite, has more in common with the heresies like Gnosticism that plagued the early church than with what we know from a historical point of view is the original Christian message. Furthermore, the idea that an institution or the gradual effect of the surrounding culture corrupted the manuscripts in such a manner that they took out those parts of theology that they already agreed with, such as polytheism and justification by works, is not plausible. This means that if, theoretically, the Book of Mormon had thousands of manuscripts dating back to the 2nd century A.D., the Protestant could, in theory, make the argument that the LDS doctrines are the result of outside influences, since their beliefs more closely align with those of the surrounding culture. The Protestant can propose a great apostasy that erased their original message, but not the Mormon. So, the great apostasy lacks a culprit for both practical and theological reasons. At this point, let me give a couple answers that are specific to the LDS Church that do not necessarily apply to Step 5. The third problem is that there is pretty much an unbroken line of tradition going back to the apostles. For instance, Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, was directly appointed by the apostle John, and Polycarp in turn would have appointed successors to go in his place. Now, I have not read a ton of the Church Fathers' writings yet, but from what I know, what they wrote pretty much conveys the same fundamental truths, meaning there is nothing in their writings about polytheism or progression to godhood. And their writings go back about as far as the extant manuscripts do, meaning I could make the same arguments from their writings that I made from the manuscripts. Furthermore, to say that the church was wiped out on the institutional level would have broken this line of tradition. Now, to us, that's not a big deal, but the LDS Church believes that the apostles could directly transfer their authority. To call into question those whom the apostles appointed would, in the Mormon's mind, call into question the authority of the apostles and of Jesus who appointed them. I am sure the Catholic Church could provide more detail on that. The fourth problem is that the great apostasy contradicts what is in Scripture. Jesus told Peter in Matthew 16, verse 18, that Peter was the rock on which he would build his church, and that the gates of hell would not overcome it. Now, if the true church on an institutional level was obliterated off the face of the earth for 1800 years so that Joseph Smith needed to restore it, I would say that the gates of hell overcame the church. We could add the conspicuous lack of Old or New Testament prophecy about the great apostasy that was coming. Surely, if God knew that the church as an institution would disappear for 1800 years, he would have said something about it. He certainly did before Israel apostatized, giving prophecy after prophecy after prophecy, speaking of their apostasy, the resulting judgment, and their eventual return to the promised land. And why are there no prophecies about Joseph Smith, the agent of restoration? And why was there no LDS prophet to witness to all these false churches in that 1800 years? When Israel went apostate, God sent them prophets. When the Christian church struggled, God sent them apostles. Why no messenger to convey the truth, which apparently was LDS doctrine? So, there are several passages and concepts in Scripture that contradict the great apostasy. I realize that I am evidencing my point with the same scriptures that the LDS Church says are corrupted. But how corrupted would the Bible have to be wrong on this subject? Quite a bit. Generally, Mormons believe that the Bible is incomplete, having many plain and precious truths that are left out. What they generally don't say is that the Bible contradicts their theology. If there is a contradiction, though, then they must say that those parts of the Bible that contradict them are wrong, in which case there needs to be a plausible culprit, for which there are none. Please note that this case study on the great apostasy was meant to bolster step 5 of the defensive argument, so I am not picking on the LDS Church here. It just so happens to be that they are a prime example of those who would deny step 5, which is that the first known manuscripts accurately contain the events of Jesus' ministry. Because the answers I gave here could apply to most objections targeting step 5. For if one is to say in any form that the gospel accounts we have today do not contain the original message, they must face the problems I presented here. Firstly, it would use a double standard. For to question the Gospels would be to question just about all of ancient history. Secondly, it lacks a plausible culprit for both practical and theological reasons. Practically speaking, whoever did it did such a good job that, to my knowledge, there is not one extant manuscript containing the original message, which is almost impossible. Theologically speaking, whoever did it likely had beliefs that contradicted the manuscripts that they supposedly had such influence over. Thirdly, it runs into the problem of church tradition, and fourthly, it contradicts what is in Scripture today. Now, the third and fourth reasons were a bit more LDS specific, but the first and second reasons, where I spent the bulk of my time, could apply to most objections targeting step 5. As it is, we can know with near historical certainty that what is in the gospel accounts today is what the original gospel authors wrote. So here we have our fifth step filled out, which established that the first extant manuscripts contain what the gospel writers originally wrote. In step 6, I will show that the gospels were accurately transmitted and translated through time in the 1250 years or so from the first extant manuscripts to when the printing press was invented. You might have heard, well, weren't the gospel accounts translated a bunch of times? This is compared to the game of telephone, where one starts with a phrase and then relays it to someone else, who relays it to someone else. At the end, the original phrase is compared to the final phrase in order to show how different they are. Apparently, the gospel accounts are no different. Critics will also cite the supposed 400,000 differences between the New Testament manuscripts. We will start by addressing these differences. It is true that many differences exist. However, almost 100% of them are minor and do not compromise the meaning of the passage. And of the major differences, which are usually in the footnotes of the Bible, none compromise the overall intent of the Gospels or their basic message. Let's look at the distortion rates of some different texts. This is taken from an online source that I could not find when it came time to cite it, but you could probably verify the information if you like. But the Mahabharata, which is a Hindu text, has a distortion rate of 10% between its manuscripts. These mean that if we compare two manuscripts randomly, then on average, 1 out of every 10 words will be different, although I'm pretty sure it's more involved than that. For the Iliad, the distortion rate is 5%, and for the New Testament, it is 0.2%. That is exceptionally low, given 3 things. The first is the number of manuscripts, about 24,000 to be exact. The second is the number of languages the manuscripts were translated to. These included Latin, Greek, Aramaic, Armenian, Syriac, Coptic, and many others. The third is the time they span, which is about 1,300 years. The fact that they don't contradict despite being copied about 24,000 times across many languages over about 13 centuries of time is incredible. I agree with the skeptic in that those who wrote the New Testament accounts played the game of telephone. The only difference is that I say, according to the evidence, they were very, very good at it. An additional point about the 400,000 differences is that as long as they are minor, instead of hiding the text meaning, they actually allow us to know the exact meaning of the text in the same way that providing synonyms of a word will help one know its exact meaning. So if I were a skeptic, I would not bring these up. As it is, citing the 400,000 differences is misleading in two ways. Firstly, it makes it look like there are major contradictions in the manuscripts when in reality they are remarkably similar. And secondly, the number does not adjust for the massive number of manuscripts for the New Testament. Wouldn't it make sense that a work with a great number of manuscripts would have a great number of differences, even if the distortion rate was the same? And remember, the consistency between manuscripts was used in step 5, which makes it more difficult for one to propose a great apostasy, given that whoever did it needed an incredible amount of power and scope so as to make all the manuscripts say the same altered message. As it is, the great apostasy and alterations like it lack a culprit. We have finished step 6, which is that the gospel accounts were accurately transmitted and translated through time. Our last step, step 7, is to show that the final versions of the gospel accounts, as seen in 1440 AD, do not contradict. Some would say that the gospel accounts as we have them today contradict. We addressed a couple of these supposed contradictions earlier, such as the number of angels at the tomb of Jesus. Others might cite the omission of certain stories in the Gospels. For example, one Gospel might contain a story and the others don't. The key point here is that the Gospel accounts overlap, not contradict. They fit together like the pieces of a puzzle. I gave a sample of this when I combined the 4 accounts of Jesus' death. Many of the so-called contradictions are simply viewing the same event from different angles, but they can be reconciled just as lawyers would reconcile eyewitness testimonies in court. To show this in comprehensive detail would take much time, which is why I will refer to books like The Big Book of Bible Difficulties by Norman Geisler or the John MacArthur Study Bible, which has a way of anticipating objections. If there is any remaining doubt, I encourage one to consult their local pastor or friend that knows a lot about the Bible and ask them. Most Christians I have talked to, provided they are somewhat deep thinkers, are willing to honestly consider difficult questions. If one takes these steps and still has an unresolved contradiction, I encourage them to ask themselves, do the gospel accounts contradict each other on a major level? In other words, are any of the core truths compromised? Like if this was an unresolved contradiction, would one conclude that Jesus didn't exist, die, claim to be the Messiah, and resurrect? The answer to this will be no, in which case the truthfulness of the events the gospel accounts agree upon is maintained. Many skeptics will find one itty-bitty contradiction in the gospel accounts and act as if that undermines their entire testimony. That is not appropriate. If there were 4 eyewitness accounts of a robbery in a court case, and one witness said it happened at 10 a.m., another at 10:30, another at 11, and another at 11:30, no one would say that the robbery did not happen because they disagreed on the details. Likewise, one should not reject the core truths of the New Testament on the basis of a minor contradiction. As it is, the 24,000 manuscripts and the astounding rate of agreement between them, the 100-year gap, the independent and overlapping nature of the 4 testimonies, the qualifications of the writers, and the complete lack of evidence for fraud, evidence the events that the 4 Gospels hold in common just as much as if they did before, even if there are contradictions. For some reason, the Bible is treated as though it is either infallible or a complete fraud. Skeptics that treat the Bible this way would readily trust the truthfulness of other historical documents, even though those contain contradictions. Besides, from a historical perspective, the trustworthiness of a given document is not either or, it is more of a spectrum. So, the skeptic shouldn't have to believe that the Bible we have today is infallible to trust its major claims. The Christian doesn't have to believe that either. It is possible, even from a Christian perspective, that God breathed the original words, but that they were altered over time. Luckily, the evidence does not suggest this, but the idea that the Bible has to be infallible or else is just not true from either party. If we look at the Bible this way, and particularly the gospel accounts, the certainty with which we can know the vast majority of the New Testament events is far greater than the certainty with which we know most of what is contained in our textbooks of ancient history. So we have just completed step 7, which is that the gospel accounts do not contradict. That marks the end of part 4 and of the argument for the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. In part 5, I will summarize parts 1 through 4 and give their implications. I hope to see you there.